But the topic, of course, today is carbohydrates and weight loss, what you really need to know. This is another one where I start out a bit sciencey, a bit nerdy, if you will, because I want to make sure that we have a good background before we start talking about the impacts on your diet. And hopefully that will get you a good base, and then we can move forward from there. So remember, it is the quality of your calories that matter. And I think it's possible, I don't know, all of the macronutrients sort of can claim that this is where it's the most important, but carbohydrates, the quality of carbohydrates can vary dramatically. And so it's an area to pay attention to for certain. So what we'll cover today, what are carbohydrates? So we'll start out with the basics. We'll also talk about the foods that are considered carbohydrates or that contain them in large enough quantities where we call them, I suppose, carby foods. The types of carbohydrates out there, so how we can sort of break it down into the different types. You might hear terms like simple, refined, complex, and so I'm going to try and explain that a little bit more. Also, the effects on the body. We'll start with the digestion process, and then also, of course, how blood sugars respond and how it functions throughout the body there. And I will also touch on some healthy tips for eating carbs, because there is a way to maximize their benefits, not feel like you have to sacrifice them completely in order to reach your goals. In fact, carbohydrates can be very healthy, so it's important to include them in your diet. And of course, question and answers at the end, as always. And you can ask about this topic or any other topic that comes to mind. Okay, so starting at the basics, what are carbohydrates? Well, they are one of the main 3 macronutrients that our body needs to function. It's usually, with most diets, in the greatest amount in terms of percentage of calories. You can see the little blue part of the pie chart here. It's taking up the most space. And it's also the body's primary source of energy and the brain's preferred source in the form of glucose. Right now, we're talking, of course, about standard diets. When we're talking about, say, a keto diet, the pie chart will look quite a bit different, and there are reasons for that, but I'm going to talk standard to start with. So what foods are considered carbs, or at least carb-containing foods? So, of course, fruits and fruit juices, grains such as breads, pastas, cereals, rice. You also have the starchy vegetables like potatoes, corn, beans, and squash. Quinoa, which is technically referred to as a pseudo grain, and it also has quite a bit of protein, but it is a grain, or pseudo grain, I suppose, and we can say that also is considered a carbohydrate. And of course, snack foods, sweets, candies, the chips, crackers, cookies that a lot of people think of, those generally fall into the category of carbs. Now, how many carbs does a person need in a day? For the average adult, the typical recommendation or range is around 45 to 65% of total calories per day. I tend to edge on the 45% side more than on the 65% side, but it does depend on the person. And certainly if someone is very athletic or doing a lot of running, endurance training, their carbohydrate needs will probably be higher. Now, at 4 calories per gram, what that turns into is, if you're at the 2,000 calorie level, that's 225 to 325 grams. At 1,500 calories, that looks more like 170 to 245 grams. And at 1,200 calories, we've got 135 to 195 grams. I don't expect people to count these out individually. That would be a very difficult and tedious process, but just to give you sort of an idea. And there are ways to visualize what that means in real life. So a slice of bread, for example, real fast, I'll say most people will look at it and say that's about 15 grams of carbohydrates. And there are tools and resources to do that, so you don't have to memorize that or feel like you have to weigh everything out, if that were something that you were trying to do or were interested in doing. When it comes to carbohydrates as well, we were talking about just the general, how many do you need in a day, taking up the percentage of your calories. Now, when we're looking at added sugars, because we really want to pay attention to how many of those we're getting, and that's sugar that's added to a food. And that does include if you're adding honey to a food that wouldn't normally have it. And so the dietary guidelines here is that less than 10% of calories. So I put this respective to the 2,000 calorie level, 1,500, 1,200 here. But the American Heart Association actually has a bit of a stricter guideline. I, in a way, prefer it personally. And that is generally less than 25 grams for women, less than 36 grams for men total in the day. Also, fiber is considered a carbohydrate. It's not caloric, but it is considered carbohydrate. And so there's a difference there because rather than raising blood sugars, fiber is generally considered to help keep blood sugars on a more even keel. And the recommendations for fiber is about 21 to 25 grams a day for women and 30 to 38 grams a day for men. I will mention that the American diet, we tend to not get this much in a day. And so if that is also, again, something that you are pursuing, it's always good to go slowly so that you don't have gastric discomfort. Now, to get the science out of the way, the types of carbs. So first of all, the simple carbs, and this is more chemically speaking, but we'll get into this. So there are the monosaccharides, which are single sugar molecules. So you can see these hexagons over here. Most of them are hexagons. Each one of these, when they're not joined, are the monosaccharides. So the monosaccharides of dietary interest are glucose, fructose, which is actually five-sided, and galactose. Then we move on to the disaccharides. So that is two monosaccharides joined together. You can see again in the picture here, those are examples of those disaccharides. So you can see that there is sucrose, which is a combination of glucose and fructose. And so that's table sugar, actually. So you have that combo here. And then lactose, which of course is the sugar that naturally occurs in milk, is a combination of glucose and galactose. And then maltose, which is in malted meal, malted barley, things like that, is a combination of glucose and glucose. So if we're talking about foods that contain these, a lot of times we're talking in terms of simple carbs, a lot of candies, non-diet sodas, so sodas that have the high fructose corn syrup, fruit juice, honey, etc. And of course, yes, lactose is the sugar in milk and dairy, and you consider that as sort of a simple carb. It's not a refined carb, of course. It exists naturally, and we wanted to just mention that. Now moving on to the complex carbs, which is a term a lot of us hear. And those are made up of oligosaccharides. So that's 3 to 10 of the monosaccharides. So the glucose, fructose, and galactose combined together in a chain. And typically these are non-digestible, so prebiotics. So they do feed the bacteria in the gut because they are a type of fiber. However, if you have IBS or you know someone who has IBS, you may hear them talk about oligosaccharides because this is an area that can sometimes be difficult to break down for some people and can cause more discomfort with digestion. Some examples of foods that have oligosaccharides are onions, lentils, the Jerusalem artichoke, garlic, cabbage, and even bananas to a degree. And they don't just contain these types of carbohydrates, but they contain them in high enough quantities to make note of. And then finally, moving on to the polysaccharides, and this can go into the thousands in terms of chain length, which are long chains of monosaccharides linked together in some form, and that is considered your starches. Also other types of fiber that aren't the oligosaccharides. And some examples of foods with polysaccharides are the potatoes, pasta, rice, bran, corn, beans, etc. And one thing to note, because I don't have it specifically mentioned here, is that sugar alcohols, they are also considered carbohydrates, but they don't really fit into these categories. They are technically termed hydrogenated mono, di, and oligosaccharides. They're also called an alcohol because of the way that the chemical structure is and the, what we say, the all at the end on that type of molecule. So they don't quite affect blood sugars the same way, which is why a lot of times people see them in sugar-free foods. But there is some caloric value, some effect on blood sugar, but not to the same degree. So you may have noticed and may be thinking, wait a minute, pasta as a complex carb? I was told that I should stay away from that. I was told that that's not good, and it sounded like complex carbs were better. So there is a slight difference between the scientific term that we just covered and sort of the everyday term you hear, probably the everyday term that I more or less use with everyone that I talk to. And so chemically speaking, complex carbs, they're named because of the structure and size of the molecule. So even white bread is called a complex carb just because of the starch content. However, everyday speaking, the emphasis when we're talking about complex carbohydrates, we want an emphasis on fiber-rich whole foods. So like I mentioned here, the whole wheat versus white bread, whole fruits, and that type of thing, or beans and the whole potatoes, sweet potatoes. Those are more the complex carbohydrates that I think are important to emphasize, because now we're focusing in on things that are going to be a little bit more friendly to blood sugars and overall health, because it's going to have more nutritional value as well. And I break it down here as well. So there's we take that complex carb, you have the refined complex carbohydrate, like I said, white bread or white rice, many breakfast cereals, and then the unrefined, which we were focusing on, like steel cut oats, whole wheat bread, and the starchy vegetables. But remember, and I mentioned this, all digestible carbohydrates can increase your blood sugar, but how much and how quickly that can vary. So I will be touching on that in a couple of slides from now. So what happens after eating carbohydrates? And I wanted to just mention this very quickly because we talk about blood sugars rising, falling, and what's going on. This is going to be a very abridged version. There's a whole lot more that can be involved, and I wasn't going to take you to a university lecture today. So digestion begins in the mouth. Always fun to have someone take a plain saltine cracker, hold it in their mouth, and they can tell that it starts to turn sweet over time because we have enzymes already starting to break those long chains of carbohydrates down into these smaller versions. Because the ultimate goal is to break them down into monosaccharides for the small intestine to absorb them. Of course, non-digestible carbohydrates, fiber, they continue on to the large intestine. So after it gets absorbed into the small intestine, glucose enters the bloodstream. Fructose and galactose sort of have their own journey because for the body to use them for fuel, they need to be converted to glucose in the liver. And when it's in the bloodstream, it gets used by the body. Also, when glucose enters the bloodstream, of course, you see your blood sugars rise. And so the pancreas responds by releasing insulin to help deal with that. I'm talking about an average person. If someone has type 1 diabetes, this is not quite the process here. Now, insulin helps move glucose. I often will refer to it as insulin holds the key to the cells in the body because it will move the glucose from your bloodstream to the cells in your body, and specifically muscle, liver, and fat cells are the ones that are responding to that insulin. And those cells, once it enters the cells, they're used as energy, or the liver and muscle can convert it and store it as glycogen for use later or for physical activity. And then any excess will get stored as fat. Now let's talk about how they can affect your blood sugars. So simple, and I more or less mean refined carbohydrates here to a degree here, since we want to talk about what they're doing once they get absorbed and how we're seeing them act in the blood sugar. They cause a quick spike, and when the insulin comes into play, fall in glucose. And you can see that with the red line exemplified here on the chart. And when you have that sharp rise and fall, of course, your feelings of satiety might not be as strong because it was a quick burn. And so cravings and overeating can tend to happen with these types of refined carbohydrates. When we're talking about candies and also fruit juice to a degree. So when consumed in excess, which can happen if you're being led to having cravings, overeating, then that can lead to an increased likelihood for storage as fat. Also, chronically high blood sugars can contribute to insulin resistance. And the GLP medications, which are helping with weight loss, but they're also supposed to help with insulin sensitivity. But eating refined carbohydrates and simple carbs frequently may actually blunt the effectiveness of those types of medications, which is not what we're looking for. And of course, added sugars are associated with chronic inflammation and cardiovascular disease. So we want to try and limit those. Then complex carbs are more of a slow burn. They can also, if they are eaten in excess, can lead to weight gain, but they're a slow burn. So you can see here with these other types of the yellow and green on the chart here, you can see that they're not raising the blood sugar quite as high, and they're also having a more smoothed out effect. So instead of spikes and falls, you're having more waves. And because the complex carbs have fiber most often, they can promote your gut health. They will generally provide more micronutrients because those haven't really been stripped away by the processing. And soluble fiber may also help manage cholesterol to a degree. I should mention a couple things in this chart. So first of all, the area here, which looks like words that have been cut off, is talking about insulin levels. So these numbers here are insulin level. And so it's talking about how your insulin is responding to each one of these. And then you may also see here where this is listing glycemic index and glycemic load. Glycemic index, I'm sure you've heard the word and you may be familiar with it, but it is essentially a measure of food by how fast it can raise blood sugars. Glycemic load takes the serving size into account versus the glycemic index sort of did standardization of everything, where glycemic load is going to assume you're not going to eat the same amount of table sugar as you would potato. So there are some lists of these. I believe I will look up here what the name of the place is. The University of Sydney does have a glycemic index list. It's very, very comprehensive, but I also have access to a few lists as well if anyone is interested. So now we've talked about how it's working in the body and wanting to make sure that we can maximize the benefits, maximize the nutritional value of these foods. You do want to limit your refined carbohydrates as much as possible. Those are the ones that have a stronger effect on your blood sugar and generally have fewer nutrients that are valuable. And of course, choose whole fruits instead of fruit juice. Whole fruits are going to be more filling. Fruit juice is more of a fast-acting and, in a way, condensed version. I believe I've mentioned this before, but fruit juice, if you think of a glass, example here, a glass, if this were filled with juice, that would be equivalent to almost 2 or maybe 3 oranges, whereas you'd probably be eating only 1 orange in a sitting. And that can make a big difference on your blood sugar and also your caloric intake. And it's much easier to drink your foods than it is to eat them physically. So it can get those calories in quickly. Also, you want to try and avoid regular sodas as much as possible. That across the board, if I could get rid of one thing, actually 2 things nutrition-wise, I will tend to stand on my soapbox about fruit juices and sodas. And then when you are eating carbs, even the complex types, adding a protein and fat containing food will help immensely in terms of blood sugar control, but also giving you a more balanced snack or meal. So I gave some examples here, like pita with hummus, not just a pita on its own, apple with peanut butter, or toast and an egg. And so you can see that those combinations, they're simple, and a lot of us do them without even thinking, but that will make each one of those carb-containing foods a lot more healthy, if you will. And then if you are eating a packaged carbohydrate-containing food, I do think it's nice to be able to use the Altman rule if you're looking at the food label. So you look at the food label and you look for grams of fiber on that label. And you want it to be at least 3 grams of fiber or more. And then add that to the grams of protein per serving. Those added together must be greater than the grams of sugar listed on there. And I am talking about more carby foods. I don't think yogurt counts if you're looking at just the natural sugars that would exist because of the lactose. Added sugars, though, you would want to pay attention to. I guess breads, or if you were having cereals or really anything like that, that would be a nice spot to look at that type of label and apply this rule. Also, though, I do want us to live in the real world. If you like pasta, I'm not going to tell someone that they have to eat whole wheat pasta if they don't think that it tastes good. Food should be good. Food should not be gross. You should be able to enjoy it. So if you like pasta, well, then make the sauce the star of the show. If you're eating a primavera or a marinara or a meat sauce bolognese, that's where the nutrition is. That's where you're going to get the maximum benefit. And if that is the star of the show, I say use those noodles more like a garnish. And that doesn't mean you have to have only 4 noodles, but have it be more of a texture add than being a second plate on your first plate. And then a phrase I use often is the portion makes the poison, because carbohydrates are valuable and they can be helpful, but you just want to be careful how much at one time, and again, combining it, because anything can be problematic if it's in too much or too big. So putting it together, carbohydrates are an important part of our diet, and it is the body's preferred energy source. I'll pause for a moment to mention, yes, we do use fat and we do use muscle as energy sources as well, but those do take a little more work. And so carbohydrates, they are the body's preferred energy source, but we do have those fallbacks, and they are important in the process of weight loss too. There are a variety of carbohydrates out there, and not all are bad. In fact, there's many healthy options available. Do you want to encourage that we select the whole food options of carbohydrates whenever possible? And at the very end, as I mentioned, you want to be sure to combine your carbs with protein and fat to avoid those blood sugar spikes and crashes, which can lead to the overeating and the problems that we want to avoid. But that concludes the discussion, and I wanted to make sure to allow some time for any questions that anyone may have. I know it was again, a bit of a dense topic, but I hope that you found it interesting. And again, in case you weren't here when I was doing that housekeeping initially, then you want to make sure to look at the bottom left of the display screen, which would be where the Q&A options are. And then you should be able to choose to either have your name, or you can select anonymous. And what I often say is that if you do list your name, I most likely will say it out loud, so you just know that I'm responding to you. But if you have questions about this or really any other nutrition related topic, feel free to write in. I will be sitting here. I know there's a bit of radio silence, and that's okay. I just want to make sure to give you the opportunity to type if you do have questions. And if not, that's okay too. Here we go. I'm going to All right, so the question is, how do you feel about carbs with added protein, like protein plus pasta or Dave's Killer Bread? Oh, great. I think that's a great question. And that's a perfect way to think about that combination, the combining of carbs plus protein. So yes, protein plus pasta is ideal. So if you've got your pasta and you've got, say, grilled chicken or shrimp. I never think of seafood because I don't personally like it, but yeah, shrimp with your pasta, that's going to be way healthier and also going to help moderate those blood sugar rises. Dave's Killer Bread is also one of my favorite bread companies because I think they have a good product, a good mission as well, but they make very healthy types of bread out there. And so that's a really good start. And then, of course, adding protein is going to be helpful there. So yes, exactly. That's exactly my mindset on that. So I wanted to, glad that you asked that. And I don't know if you all can see me, so I want to make sure that you know that I'm here live answering. So yes, that was a perfect way to bring that into light. And I believe, I'm trying to think of some other protein carb combinations, like I mentioned, the apple and the peanut butter, or some people even like baby bell cheese to add. Cottage cheese is a really good option because it's also high in protein, and you can add that with, say, fruit. Cottage cheese and pineapple is a classic that many people enjoy. Thank you for your question. Let's see, I'm gonna make sure I move question and answer area to where I can see it in time. And I know we're already coming up on the close to the 12:30 hour. I will wait, of course, until 12:30, but if you do have questions, if you don't get a chance to write it in, or perhaps you're on the phone and it's impossible to type that out, feel free, if there is a question that you think of when this is over, please reach out to the Premier Weight Loss group or reach out to any of the staff there when you're there for your next appointment, or through email or calling. They would be more than happy to get your question sent to me so that I can answer it. I want to make sure that I'm available for all of you whenever you need. Make sure I can get those answers to you. But I do believe we have hit 12:30. So if no one else has questions, I hope that means I explained it well, but if anything does come up, or if you have anything that you want further expanded upon, again, please let me or the staff at Premier Weight Loss know. Happy to answer questions. I love doing research. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining me at this lunch hour. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and afternoon. And I hope to see you again in the next one. Thank you so much.